New York City presents us with a microcosm of what much of the world may look like in the coming decades. Sure, today it may look different than your community, but when you see past the entertainment, apparent materialism, the fashion, and the money, you find a rich melting pot of diversity. People of all nations, creeds, and socioeconomic livelihoods living within steps of one another. Children of all races and languages attending schools side by side. It's a setting that is diverse, multicultural, and pluralistic in every way, creating a new setting for Christianity to advance within. And it's not just New York, but in major cities worldwide, this is the norm. And it's not as far away from your community as you might think. Experts predict that over the next 40 years, 80% of the world will live in cities, where just 2% did 100 years ago. And urban culture will be the stage where most of life plays out. Now, New York is symbolic of the new world we live in, where every faith is valued and respected, and Christianity no longer holds a special place in the public square. It really begs the question, what makes Christianity distinct? And is it even helpful or appealing to most people in our world today? You know, people are asking the question, and do we have answers for what does Christianity have to say about the environment, about justice, about consumerism and materialism and wealth? And most importantly, does Christianity only care about its own, or does it care about those outside the faith? As we think long term about our changing world and the implications for Christianity, it's also important we be very aware of the things that don't change, which is the Great Proposal. You see, the Great Proposal is just that, it's great, because it offers to people a compelling way to view the world. It makes sense of all reality. No matter what setting you live in, whether it's New York City or a small town, or how society changes in the future, you can be sure of one thing, and that is that people will always be seeking truth and transcendence. And Christianity has the greatest hope to propose. We've talked a lot about the Christian life. We've talked about the church. We've talked about really how this relationship with Christ changes everything about who we are as Christians. But one thing that I think is so important and appealing is that the Christian life is something that really in the world, it appeals to people when we demonstrate it for them.
In these sessions, Gabe, you see the outline of the faith given once for all, a coherent story which brings people to where we are today, the conclusion of the story. Every story has an ending, and people expect that as well, by the way. But the ending fits the human needs, just as the whole story that we have unfolded fits the human need for how they live. And so the beauty of the truth given once for all is it fits. But there's this built-in desire for justice and for an end. And that's where we come to the last item in our analysis.
You know, N.T. Wright writes about this in his book, Simply Christian. He talks about these four signposts of the kingdom. He talks about the longing for justice.
Well, justice especially, because everybody has an innate sense of justice, that there ought to be a law. People get mad. If a person can be a positive heathen and he's driving in an automobile, he gets cut off and he'll shake his fist and say, someday you'll get yours for this. Well, where? I mean, he didn't violate the law, he just cut him off. People have a desperate need for the scales of life to be balanced, for wrongs to be righted. So this is part of the way we're made.
Yeah, so as you talk about justice, I mean, there is this sense of finality. I mean, there is a judgment. We can't avoid that.
There is, and that will happen when Christ returns. And the scripture is very clear that he will come, that the end of history will be Christ's return, when the kingdom of which we've seen all these signs and which are inbred into us comes in its fullness, and when Satan is completely vanquished. The flag of the kingdom was planted. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. And then, however, the battle goes on, sort of like after the invasion in World War II of Normandy. The fight continued until Hitler was finally defeated. The fight's going on, and Satan ends up losing, because we know the promise of God on that Jesus will return.
There seems to be a lot of wasted time, though, in the church, discussing and speculating about how that's going to happen, when it's going to happen. Is that pointless?
Well, now you really got the audience watching us upset, because A lot of people spend a lot of time discussing this, and it is important for us to understand the signs of the times because the church has always lived in expectation of his imminent return, which is a good way to live because you want to be at your post and make every minute count. What is futile, in my opinion, and counterproductive is to be speculating on when it's going to be, because then what you do, Dwight Moody, late in his great, glorious ministry, believed that Christ was about to return and had told him, man the lifeboats and save all you can. And all the good works he was doing in Chicago, he stopped doing because he thought any day Christ is going to return. And we get books published and people obsessing over this. Augustine, Calvin, all the great scholars through the years have said, one thing we know, Christ will return. We can read the apocalyptic scriptures and we can understand the general framework of what's going to happen, and we have different views on how it'll happen, but they refuse to comment on it. They refuse to talk about it, and they discourage discussion of it because it took time away from more productive tasks. And I have my own ideas on how it's going to happen, but that's not really worth distracting us from the main goal, which is to live as Christians in this tension you just described.
Well, but the one thing we do know about when Christ returns is there will be justice.
Yeah, that's what's so beautiful about it. Everything that N.T. Wright says the human being longs for is a longing that will be ultimately satisfied. That's the final justice. That's the final balancing the scales. You know, we achieve it very imperfectly here. I've been working in the prisons for 32 years. I've seen men on death row, women who were innocent. I've seen a defiant John Wayne Gacy proclaim his innocence and almost angry that he was being prosecuted. But the ultimate justice of God is shalom, which you mentioned earlier, Gabe. The concept that we will live in complete concord and harmony with Christ in our midst. He promised the Jews that he would pitch his tent in their midst. He said in the New Testament, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. Pitch the tent is the literal translation. And in the new heavens and earth to come, he will pitch his tent in our midst. That's what every Christian lives for, that great eschatological hope of Christ's return.
And you know, that brings us to this interesting point that you and I have had a lot of discussions about, and that is that the Christian life, to me, as I understand it, as you've taught me so well, is the most joyful way to live. It's the way that makes the most sense out of life. Yet so many Christians hang out under this banner of we're supposed to be hated, and we almost sometimes use it as an excuse to be judgmental, to be hypocritical, to just sort of be self-righteous and do some of these things. But the reality is, the life that Christ calls us to lead is winsome. It is attractive. So help me with that tension.
Well, the tension has always been that the faith given once for all, entrusted to the saints once for all, the title of this book. When you go through its basic elements, you see that it conforms to reality, which is the test of truth. You see that it works. It succeeds. It does bring about transformed lives. That's the ultimate test. And I've seen in hundreds, thousands of converts in prisons, how they've been transformed from being the worst, you'd say, animal in a cage to upright citizens. Mm-hmm. So the real thing, the orthodox gospel, that's a word that's in disuse today because people think we're talking about dry, dusty doctrine. It's what the story is that we tell. You know, it's very interesting that the church that is exploding today is not in the West. The church that is exploding is in Asia and Africa. And the reason for it is very simple. They are practicing and teaching the real thing. But it's growing around the world because it's delivering the goods. The Catholic Church came up with something called liberation theology. It was a blend of Marxism and Christianity. And they thought it would appeal to the poor through South America and Latin America. And they came to them and they said there'll be redistribution of income and we will get the government to do this and to pass out money. And they thought that would cause the church to just explode in Latin America. It did just the reverse. Why? Because the people had heard the promises of the government before and they didn't believe it. They weren't buying that. They turned away from it in the droves. Where did they go? They went to the Pentecostal church. And when two British sociologists went down to South America in the early part of the 90s to study why Pentecostalism was exploding and evangelicalism exploding, what they found was the testimony of the wives saying, when we came to the Lord, And when we started to worship the Lord, we found out what the gospel really was. Our husbands stayed out of the taverns at night and came home with us. And so the women went out and spread the gospel. Why? It worked. It gave them the kind of life they wanted to live. It's a wonderful parable for us today in this country where we're struggling over, do we really believe what the apostles taught and what the Bible says? Of course we got to believe it, because that's the real thing. And it's exciting when we do.
And sometimes in our culture, I know consumerism, materialism, some of these things can many times take away the sense that we have this need that sometimes in the third world is felt much more easily.
Exactly. It is really bracing and invigorating and exciting to know that you're believing what people have practiced and believed and given their lives for 2,000 years. I mean, I'm not interested in the latest fad that's going to pass away. I had a experience that was so powerful for me because I went to Mars Hill in Athens. Have you been there?
No.
Well, it's a big rock that sits on a huge boulder that's up on top of a small mountain in Athens, and the Parthenon is just to the right of it. And you have to really crawl up the thing because you can slide down it. And I stood where Paul addressed the Areopagus, the wise men of the age in Athens, and delivered in Acts 17 that magnificent message of the gospel. And they'd never heard it. And I stood there where Paul delivered that message. And I suddenly realized I'm standing on the ground where that most powerful message was brought to the center of culture and learning in the world, Athens. And then I looked over at the Parthenon and realized that every Good Friday in that monument, the flag at noon goes to half-staff. And on Sunday morning, it is raised full. Even though only 2 people or 3 people or a few people followed Paul when they heard that message. That's the gospel, which has endured unchanged over all of this time. I'm a conservative. By that I mean I believe wisdom comes from revelation in the revelation. Truth is revealed to me. It's not something I invent. But I've discovered you can see much further in the future by standing on the shoulders of those who went before you. And Christians need a humility and a healthy respect for the wisdom of the ages where the church has accumulated all of this tradition, which is so helpful to us when we understand it. And this becomes really exciting. I call it the joy of orthodoxy, to believe the same thing that the first century church gave their lives for.
You know, what I get so excited about, Chuck, is when I think about the history of Christianity. I know for me, I didn't have a complete understanding of this. And in our times today, you know, especially in this younger generation, there's this sense to not be proud of Christianity because in today's terms, it doesn't mean a lot to the culture. The culture looks down on it, and for good reason. We've caused some of that and brought it on ourselves. But when you look back historically and see all the contributions that Christians have made to culture, to society, to creating, you know, a better world for everybody to enjoy, it's amazing, and it actually makes you proud, and it gives us some sense of vision for the future. But tell us some of the historical markers of Christianity.
Our minds are being poisoned today by popular culture and by higher education, which proclaims the wonders of multiculturalism, that all cultures are morally equivalent and we aren't, as Westerners, to be proud of our heritage. When you stop and think, the first century Christians were fighting against abortion and infanticide. Slavery, Christopher Hitchens says that Christians perpetuated slavery. Slavery is acknowledged in the Bible because it occurred during the time the Bible was written. It was practiced in all of the Greek and Roman cultures. Continues to be practiced in Islam today. But the book of Philemon is a book about setting a slave free. In Timothy, Paul warns him against associating with perverts and murderers and adulterers and slave traders. Mm-hmm. And the church fought slavery in the early years. And when the Spanish conquerors came to the Western Hemisphere, they began to take slaves. And there were 2 papal edicts that were issued denouncing the fact that they had slaves and then excommunicating slave owners. And then, as we talked about in the earlier session, in the 18th century in England, when the slave trade was the biggest source of revenue to the British Empire, it was Christians who fought it and opposed it. It was Christians who were the vanguard of abolition. It was Christians who were in the civil rights movement. Christians have fought for human dignity right from the beginning. And what the Roman Church saw when they were taking care of the plague victims was that they really cared for people, and that drew people into the church. Every great innovation that we enjoy in the West today was sponsored by Christians. Capitalism was born in the northern Italian city-states because the merchants began to have a system where they could trade with one another. Democracy was really invented in the monasteries, where they started to vote. Sphere sovereignty, the idea that government wasn't absolute, divine rule of kings, was shattered by Lex Rex, a book written by Samuel Rutherford, a Scottish cleric in the Reformation. And Lex Rex meant that the law is king. The king isn't the law. And it made Western liberal democracy possible. You go back and look at the scientific method was developed by Christians who didn't buy the Greek understanding of an eternal universe because that only could lead to deductive reasoning. And the scientists who were Christians said, wait a minute, God has given us all of this creation, we can explore it. That started the inductive method. That's why chemistry came to Europe while alchemy came to China, which was considered a more advanced civilization.
This is our opportunity. I mean, this is a moment in time where when you look, the quest for spirituality is higher than ever. People are looking for some transcendent truth, and they're looking other places than Christianity. So you're right, we have to get grounded. We have to understand, I have to be grounded. I have to better understand what I believe and why, and know how to articulate that, because people are asking the questions. And if we can give that answer, if we can model it and express it, I think they'll be attracted to it. I really do. I think also, one of the things we're up against, though, in the middle of this current context is the growth and spread of Islam, and that is certainly has a growth rate right now that's faster than Christianity. What should the concerns be about that?
Well, the concern, Gabe, is that we are fighting for survival on two fronts. One front is for the soul of our own culture, which is up for grabs, and postmodernism has created a vacuum which will be filled. And the question is, does the church have the backbone, the resolve, the knowledge? Do we understand what we believe, just as you just outlined it, in order to contend for truth in our own society? And it's vitally important we do so, because we're talking about the preservation of civilization, which has occurred in its full flower in Europe and the United States. So that battle is critical. That's why Pope Benedict is saying that the primary job of the church is to re-evangelize Europe. He understands how important that culture is. It is, however, threatened even more imminently, in my opinion, by radical Islamo-fascism, what I call the fascist influence, which has permeated the Muslim Brotherhood, which is perhaps 10% of the Muslim world, but that's an awful lot of people. 1,200,000,000 Muslims, if 10% of them are jihadists. And if you start comparing the two religions, you see that it's contrary to Christianity in almost every view. There's no sense of grace, there's no sense of forgiveness, there's no immanent God, there's no sense of love. It advances by conquest, clearly in the Quran. So we must not fail to take seriously the threat that 9/11 made so clear to us, because that's only the beginning. And it's not going to go away until eventually democracy takes root in Muslim countries, and/or Muslims are converted.
And not every Muslim is seeking violence, or you're talking about radical Islamo-fascism. And I think it's important to maybe make the distinction, because in our cities and communities, in a pluralistic society, more and more we have to work alongside our neighbors. We have to work alongside people who do have other faith traditions and other beliefs than Christians do.
Yes, of course. And we should be loving to our neighbors. How does the church relate to the struggle that is going on, however you want to call it, for the younger people? A strong, vibrant church rebuilds a culture, and it is the healthy culture of the West which spreads democracy and freedom throughout the world. Therefore, we should be that healthy influence as the church, and we should be winning people to Christ. I've won many Muslims to Christ when you talk about the historicity of the resurrection, and when you explain the Trinity. So this is crucial, that we be the people of God in a dark moment in history, but there have been dark moments before, and the gospel has always survived. The gates of hell can't prevail. Remember that.
Chuck, thank you for taking time to just talk to me, to help answer my questions, to help have this discussion. I think listening to you, your experience, so much of a track record of living out the gospel in your life in every area of culture has meant the world to me. And I hope that just in this discussion, not only does it help me, but it helps so many other people.